If someone would ask me, what's your favorite feature of C#, chances are the answer would be LINQ. I've been working with C# for a few years now, so I have quite some experience with LINQ, and I have learned a lot over the years. How to use it, how not to use it. I have made a lot of mistakes in the past, and I've seen other developers make mistakes with LINQ. And I realized that there are some mistakes that are made over and over again. I'd like to show you these mistakes and how to do it better. Okay, the first thing I often see is developers calling ToList on an enumerable when they don't really need a list. Like in this example. We call the where_LINQ method to filter out entries of an enumerable, and then we call ToList. But all we do after that is iterate over the result with a for each loop, which does not require a list and can handle any enumerable. So just drop the ToList call and it will work fine. The next common mistake is actually the opposite of the previous one, not calling ToList when you should. Take a look at this example. I have an enumerable of persons that I get by calling a method called readPersons. Then, for whatever reason, I iterate over the enumerable twice. And this will probably work, but it can be improved a bit. It all comes down to how the readPersons method is implemented. If it's implemented like this, it's fine, because here we have a list being returned and we would just iterate twice over that list instance. Perfect. But if readPersons is implemented like this, it might be a little more problematic. The method is an iterator method in this case, using the yield return statement. Let's assume that the call to the loadPersons from file method has to do an expensive operation like reading a file from the file system. This would mean that in our example we would read all these files twice because we have two for each loops. The first one iterates over the enumeration from the beginning to the end, and the second loop does the same thing, which would cause the readPersons method to start from the beginning again. In cases like this, it makes sense to materialize the result of the readPersons method. Now, the ToList method iterates once over the enumerable returned by the readPersons method and stores all entries in a list. Iterating over the result with the two for each loops then means iterating over only one list instance, which is much less expensive. When you have an enumerable and you need to check if it contains elements, how do you do that? Perhaps by calling the extension method count and checking if the returned value is greater than 0. While this will work in most cases, you should not do it this way. The problem is that, depending on the type of enumerable, you may need to iterate from the beginning to the end of the enumerable to be able to calculate the number of elements in that enumerable. And as in the previous example, enumerating from the beginning to the end of the enumerable can be an expensive operation, and you are only doing it to check if the number is greater than 0, so you do not really care about the exact number. So the best approach is to always use the AnyLINQ method to check if an enumerable contains elements. Very simple. Any just needs to check that the underlying enumerator's moveNext method returns true at least once, and that's it. If you're working with a list or basically any iCollection object, you can use count, because those implementations always store the current number of elements in the collection, but I would still suggest you always working with any, so you'll be safe. If you now think, well, what if I need to check if an enumerable contains more than 5 elements? Also very easy to solve. You just skip the first 5 elements and use the any method again. Simple as that. I would say it is a general rule that you should always avoid iterating from the beginning to the end of an enumerable if possible, because there will be scenarios where you don't know which implementation of enumerable you're using, because you are working with a third-party library, for example. In such cases you simply don't know if enumerating to the end is expensive. When you call the LINQ method first to get the first element of an enumerable or the first element that satisfies our particular condition, you get an exception if there is no element. But I often see developers calling this method without being sure that there is at least one element in the enumerable, which means that sooner or later an exception will occur. So if you use this method, always check for elements, for example by using the any method. By the way, the same goes for methods like last or single. The next point is very similar to the previous one. If you call first or default on an empty enumerable of reference type objects, you will get null. So whenever you call first or default, you should also add a null check on the result, or like before, check if there are elements in the enumerable. And as before, this also applies to methods like last or default or single or default. I see this very often. You want to get the first element of an enumerable that matches a certain condition, so you write something like this. You call the var method with the condition first, and on the result you call the first or default method. And this works perfectly well, and I think technically there's no problem. But in such cases I actually do not use the var method at all, because I can pass this predicate representing the condition to first or default as well. And I think that makes the code shorter and more readable. And again, this applies to other methods as well, like any in this example. I'll be honest with you, I barely use LINQ's query syntax. In most cases I think it's an overkill and you have to write more code compared to the method syntax, as in this example. I understand that in more complex scenarios the query syntax might make more sense, but I think for most cases the method syntax is the better choice. In my opinion, the biggest mistake you can do with LINQ is not to use LINQ at all. I see code all the time where I think I could do this in one line with LINQ, but you write 10 lines to do it manually. So here's my advice: whenever you want to operate on an enumerable, always try to solve it with LINQ. I think you will be able to cover most scenarios, and the LINQ methods are always implemented to be as performant as possible. Okay, so those were 8 tips for LINQ that I learned over the last years. Do you have more tips or do you disagree with some of the ones I mentioned? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, I would appreciate it if you click the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, bye!